On July 21st and August 18th, 1922, a 54-year-old burlesque Dutch comedian and a 49-year-old vaudevillian straight man got together in the Victor Studios in Camden, New Jersey. After multiple attempts, they recorded the song that would become one of the biggest-selling records of the 1920s, selling well over 1 million copies. This same song was also the toast of Broadway, a huge seller in sheet music, spawned dozens of imitation records and stage acts, and was acclaimed as America's second national anthem. It also generated lawsuit after lawsuit, pitted friend against friend, and resulted in fortunes won and lost. Even now, over 100 years later, the language and patterns of the song are still being recycled in YouTube videos and advertising.
Oh, Mr. Gallagher, oh, Mr. Gallagher, hello, what's on your mind now, Mr. Shean?
According to most sources, Ed Gallagher was born in 1873 in San Francisco, California. Very little is known of his early life. Prior to 1895, he did work as a dancer in both the Doc Stoddard and Honey Boy Evans minstrel shows. From 1895 until 1910, he worked primarily with Joe Barrett, who is a well-known blackface comedian. Gallagher worked as the straight man of the team and developed the acts that the team performed. Most of these were some variation of what were referred to as military travesties, which was a term used for lampoons on military life. These travesties were usually some variation of a battle, such as the Battle of Bay Rum, or the Battle of What's the Use, or the Battle of Too Soon. Some of the scripts for these sketches still survive, and we can get a feel for what the show must have been like for the audience of the time. Ed Gallagher was considered one of the finest, if not the finest, straight man in burlesque at the time, and in burlesque, a good straight man was at least as valuable as a good comedian. Also, the acts he created were considered top-notch and quite valuable. In 1908, Gallagher released out two of his acts, the Battle of Bay Rum and the Battle of Too Soon. And at the same time, on the same bill, he was appearing as a solo artist in a sketch called The Chauffeur. On a personal note, Ed was married several times in his life, and his first marriage, to Eleanor Thomas Gallagher, ended in divorce in 1908. Ed was given custody of their 4.5-year-old adopted son, Edward Gallagher Jr., in the proceedings.
Why, Mr. Shean, on the day they took away our old canteen.
Al Shean was born in Germany in 1868. His birth name was Abraham Schoenberg. Sometime in the 1880s, he quit his job as a pants presser in a garment factory, changed his name to Al Shean, and went into burlesque. Along with 3 friends, he formed a musical quartet called the Manhattan Quartet. This act offered up sentimental and some comedy songs to the burlesque audience. In 1895, they modified their act to make comedy the important staple and changed the name of the act to the Manhattan Comedy 4. Eventually, by 1899, the act was top of the bill in big-time vaudeville. However, the act broke up in 1900, and Al Shean found a new partner in Charles Warren. Over the next 10 years, Shean and Warren would team up, split up, and then team up again over and over. Their 2 big hits were acts that Shean had written, Quo Vadis Upside Down, which was a travesty based on the then popular Quo Vadis, and Kitty and the Captain. Both of these acts would be performed by Warren and Shean at various times all the way through 1910. Besides performing with Charles Warren, Al also basically performed in whatever and wherever he could, in such long-remembered classics as A Highball, in which he performed with William Gilbert as Putsky and Kutsky, and The Girl Behind the Counter with Daphne Pollard. In 1901, he performed in a show called Meet a Body, which, unusual for its time, was a murder mystery comedy. Al also appeared in shows with Charles Warren besides their vaudeville acts, such as Chow Chow in 1902 and The Fisher Maiden in 1903. In 1905, during one of his frequent splits with Charles Warren, Al appeared in a production of His Highness the Bey, for which he was promised 2 years' work. Things did not go well, and he was fired before the contract was fulfilled. In 1907, he sued the producers of the show for back wages. The results of the lawsuit are not available. However, this lawsuit was just a precursor of things to come. On a personal note, Al married Johanna Davidson in 1890 and remained married to her until her death in 1944. They had a son named Lawrence in 1897 and a daughter, Selma, in 1890, who unfortunately died within a year of her birth. In 1910, Gallagher and Shean teamed up. It is unknown how or exactly when they met up, but the result was a formal 5-year partnership. They both decided to leave vaudeville and rejoin burlesque. To do so, they agreed to put forth a full-blown show and not just an act. Rather than build one from scratch, in April of 1910 they leased a show, specifically Rice and Barton's Big Gaiety Company. This was a show that was on the Columbia wheel and the burlesque world. Basically, the way a burlesque wheel worked was this. Depending on the size of the theater, it would be in a wheel. Each week, the wheel would turn, and the theater owner would get a whole new show, and the existing show would roll to the next theater on the wheel. The Columbia wheel was the largest of the burlesque wheels, so this was the big time in burlesque. It was decided to name the new show The Big Banner Show. The main feature was a musical comedy that they purchased called The Girl from Paris. Since musical theater was too upscale for burlesque, the show had to be reworked for burlesque, which meant more girls and lewd jokes. The Big Banner Show was a major undertaking, especially for Gallagher and Shean, who had never undertaken a project where they were not just performers, but producers as well. Performers had to be hired, acts ordered, and of course new songs were necessary. Legend has it that Al Shean only wrote one song in his life, the tune to Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean, but at least one other song, called Mandy Jane, is attributed to both of them from 1910. A typical evening of the Big Banner Show in 1910 would consist of the following. Annette Goldie would start off by singing coon songs, followed by the Potter-Harwell Trio doing a comedic acrobatic act. Billy Potter would do his famous two-headed act, and Gallagher and Shean would do Gallagher's Battle of Bay Rum skit. Intermission would follow, and the second act would consist of The Girl from Paris. This was a lot for the two comedians to handle, and the stress was beginning to show. By December of 1910, Billboard was reporting that there was issues with the Big Banner Show. Rehearsals were being called daily, and several of the acts had quit and needed to be replaced. Names were not named, except for that Al Shean was highly thought of, and the other partner was difficult to work with. This was the first mention in print of Ed Gallagher being difficult to work with. The Big Banner Show ran until June 1911, which was the end of the Columbia Wheels season. With the company disbanded for the season, Gallagher and Shean took Gallagher's Battle of Bay Rum to vaudeville for the summer. This would be the first time they performed as a double act in a show not of their production, and the reviews were excellent. The Big Banner Show was revamped heavily for the 1911-1912 season, and it opened to poor reviews. The writing was on the wall for the show, and by late January 1912, Ed and Al were out as the stars of the Big Banner Show, being replaced by a pair of comedians named Williams and West. Ed and Al had intended to stay on as producers of the show and move on to performing in another show. They decided to take a few weeks off before beginning a show called Boy and Girl. However, Charles Barton, who originally had leased them what became the Big Banner Show, canceled their contract and reclaimed the show as they were no longer performing in it. Thus ended their first foray into producing a burlesque show. Instead of the Boy and Girl Show, Ed and Al started in as the comic relief in the operetta The Rosemaid in May of 1912, which was legitimate theater instead of vaudeville. When the show went on the road, Ed Gallagher went with the show as it headed to the West Coast, while Al Shean decided to stay in New York. So by the end of the year, 1912, the first partnership of Gallagher and Shean was over. 1913 saw Ed Gallagher headed back to vaudeville after what would have to be called a partial success in burlesque with The Big Banner Show. He and Al Shean had managed to pull together a show that had received good reviews, but was filled with strife and ultimately failed in his second season with financial losses. So he dusted off his old chestnut routine, the Battle of Bay Rum, found a new partner named Joe Fields, and went back on the road. Joe Fields was another in a line of blackface comics that Ed had partnered with over the years, and he was considered one of the best. Billboard magazine, in June of 1913, reported that Fields was worth his weight in gold. Somehow Fields managed to get along with Ed Gallagher until mid-1914, when the duo broke up. Gallagher found yet another partner in Bob Carlin, with whom he then began performing the naval travesty Before the Mast. Once again, the double act managed to last a little over a year before splitting up in July 1915. Ed actually went into the theater for the next year and appeared in a production called Town Topics. There was an interesting story in the July 3, 1915 edition of Billboard, which discusses how Ed saved a drowning woman by jumping into the surf fully clothed. This incident was later made into a lyric in the Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean song, specifically in the sheet music. 1916 saw Ed get yet another partner. This time it was Andy Lewis. Instead of the usual Gallagher Battle of, etc. sketch, Ed came up with a routine where he played a political boss and Lewis played a judge. Reviews of the show were definitely mixed, with Gallagher getting praise as a straight man, as always, but the 22-minute act, which was long for vaudeville, was considered to have a weak ending. On a personal note, Ed remarried to marry Helen Carney, who was to have a long career in vaudeville as Helen Gallagher. Ed continued to work with Andy Lewis for the rest of 1916, but to no one's surprise, split with Andy in mid-1917. Hugh Herbert, who later became a very popular character actor in the movies, wrote a sketch for Gallagher called The Slacker. This is the first recorded time that Gallagher was using a sketch not of his own invention. He found yet another partner, named Jack Kearney, to stage The Slacker. Neither the act nor the partnership lasted very long, and in a matter of months, Ed split with Kearney and partnered up with William Lemaire to reuse the old chestnut, The Battle of What's the Use, as well as a new act called Palm Beach. The Gallagher and Lemaire partnership lasted for several months until William Lemaire was inducted into the Army in 1918. So, time for a new partner. This time, Ed partnered up with Joe Raleigh and continued touring with the old warhorse, The Battle of What's the Use, and Palm Beach. Remarkably, this team would last until 1921, with Gallagher and Raleigh performing in both the frivolities of 1919 and 1920. They will continue to use Palm Beach and the battle sketches, but the reviews were indicating that the time was about up for these old routines. They did create a new act for the 1919 frivolities called The Race, with Gallagher as the owner of a horse and Raleigh as the blackface jockey. However, this routine did not stay in their catalog past the 1919 frivolities. Even though the routines were getting reviews, one thing stayed consistent. All of the reviews praised Ed Gallagher as the best straight man in vaudeville. However, Mr. Gallagher was getting tired of feeding lines to the comedian and just standing there rolling his cigar. Also, he felt he was not making enough money. So in May 1921, it was announced that Gallagher and Raleigh had split. The $500 to $600 per week they were making just wasn't enough. At the time of the split, they both announced they had, quote, no plans for the future, unquote. That was not, at least for Ed Gallagher, quite a true statement. Al Shean took the breakup of the Gallagher and Shean partnership quite differently than Ed Gallagher. Rather than take to the boards with his old acts, he put them up for sale. He then proceeded to turn to writing for the remainder of 1912. He first wrote an act called The Golden Gate Girls for the agent Minnie Palmer and the act she was representing called The Popular Four. This was, of course, his sister Minnie Marks in an early incarnation of the Marx Brothers. Shean also wrote a one-act play called Summertime, but there is no evidence that it was ever performed. Al returned to performing in 1913, first by taking the comedic role in the operetta The Rosemaid, and then during the theatrical summer downtime by reteaming with Charles Warren and spending the summer in vaudeville. After a false start of being scheduled in A Busy Man out in San Francisco, Al ended up in a new theatrical house in San Francisco owned by famed cowboy movie star Bronco Billy Anderson. He was to be appearing in a show called The Candy Shop, which was touted as a spare-no-expense attraction. However, some expenses were spared, as Shean left the show in March of 1914 after he was being informed they were going to cut his $450 per week salary. So he moved down to Los Angeles and replaced a comedian called Joe Kane in The Girl Behind the Counter. Towards the end of the year, he placed an amusing ad in Variety for his services where he took a shot at the Candy Shop show. And to wrap up the year in style, he wrote, produced, and staged the Marx Brothers' first really successful show, Home Again. The next few years were busy with both the Home Again production and appearing in shows both in LA and Chicago, which is where he had moved his base of operations. Most of his stage appearances were with Charles Warren and included such shows as The Hero and The Infernal Triangle, which, by the way, had terrible reviews. Al spent most of 1918 appearing in a play called Friendly Enemies and did make plans on touring with it when the show went to England in late 1918. Friendly Enemies was typical of the patriotic show that was popular at the time that America entered World War I, and it also affected Al more than might be expected. His son Lawrence had just entered the service and was headed overseas to fight the Hun. Also in April of the same year, Al worked with the Marx Brothers to revise Home Again for a summer season in Chicago. It was a busy year for both the Marx Brothers and Al Shean, for as the summer season ended, Al wound up directing a new show for the brothers called The Street Cinderella. This marked a first for the Marx Brothers, as this was a true theatrical show and not a vaudeville act. As it turned out, Al did not go to England with Friendly Enemies, as the end of the year found him working a show called Flo Flo, and then he was hospitalized for the removal of an abscess on his lung. 1919 saw him recuperating from the lung operation, writing yet another show for the Marx Brothers called In Everything, appearing in Flo Flo, and acting in yet another show called Princess Pat. 1920 was not the best year for Al Shean. February saw the death of his beloved father Louis at the age of 101. The month of May saw him sign for a show called Big Joy Bell, but things took a turn for the worse again in June when Al ran over a child with his car. Al drove him to the hospital where he received several stitches. Fortunately, Al was not charged with any offense, as apparently the kid walked out right in front of him. Then in September, his mother-in-law Louisa passed away at the age of 72. Shean started the fall season in the Big Joy Bell show, in which he appeared from the opening of the season until mid-October, when illness forced him to leave the cast. Compared to 1920, 1921 was going to be a sensation.
Good morning, Mr. Gallagher. Good morning, Mr. Shean. There is something...
There are several different stories circulating about how Gallagher and Shean got back together again after almost a decade apart. Some stories state that they met on the street. Some say that Minnie Marx invited Ed over for dinner one night after accidentally meeting up with him. And there's also one where Ed simply reached out to Al and off they went. Or, as Al Shean put it was at Lake George. I was out in a motorboat and my old partner was out in a canoe. I cried, "How are you, Mr. Gallagher?" "How are you, Mr. Shean?" is how he replied. "Wouldn't that make a great song? It has a lilting sound," quoted Mr. Gallagher, "and so we got together." The version of the story that seems to get the most traction is that Minnie Marx, seeing that Al was in a lull career-wise, arranged a meeting with Ed. That does make sense, for although the Big Banner show was not the financial success that Gallagher and Shean had hoped for, the reviews that they had received working together were almost all positive. Minnie Marx simply recognized that their earning capabilities were higher together. However, what most likely happened, and it will be discussed more fully later, is that the Schubert Brothers theatrical organization got with Ed and Al and requested them to put an act together for the Schubert theaters. In May 1921, Schubert, which was one of the largest theater owners and show producers in New York, signed the team at $750 a week and informed them that whatever act they came up with, they would put in a theatrical production starting in September 1921. This sort of money for an unspecified act speaks volumes to the high regard Ed and Al were held in within the theatrical world. Until September, they would have time to put the show together and work it out in vaudeville. Regardless of how they joined up again, it was being reported in the June 3, 1921 issue of Variety that Gallagher was reteaming with Shean. This was big news indeed. By August, their new act, In Egypt, was playing in vaudeville. There were several parts to the new act. First up was the new song. In front of a desert drop cloth, two tents were set up. Al Shean, wearing a fez and a strange-looking native jacket, would walk out of one tent carrying fishing tackle. Ed Gallagher, wearing a pith helmet and smoking a cigar, would walk out of the other tent. They would exchange greetings, and off into Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean they would go. The rest of the show, which absolutely no one would remember, consisted of a skit called Crossfire and another song, Bula Bula. Nobody left the theater quoting and humming Bula Bula. So where did the song Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean come from? Much like the reteaming of Gallagher and Shean, there are different versions of how their famous song came to be. Ed Gallagher liked to tell the tale this way. According to him, when he was off stage, the stagehands would get his attention by saying, "Mr. Gallagher, oh Mr. Gallagher." As he tells it, this would make everyone laugh, so it was a small step from there to just putting the song together. Another version is that he and Al Shean just whipped the song up out of thin air. Al Shean would always tell the story that the song Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean was the only song he ever wrote. However, as we saw earlier with the song Mandy Jane, that is probably not quite the truth. Of course, the true story is a little trickier and involves another party. Brian Foy, one of the famous seven little Foys of vaudeville history, knew both Ed Gallagher and Al Shean. It was he who wrote the initial version of the famous song, or at least the lyrics. As mentioned earlier, Al Shean claimed that he wrote the tune. As a friendly gesture, Foy either gave the song to the team or sold it to them for a fairly small amount. One source said $1,000, and Ed Gallagher himself said that Brian was paid with a gold cigarette lighter. It was not uncommon for performers to help other performers, and as this was written specifically for this act, certainly Brian could not foresee any value in the song past this act. Later on, of course, he would regret his generosity. Gallagher and Shean copyrighted the song on January 17, 1922, which listed them as the songwriters. So what kind of song was Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean? Basically, it is a patter song. This give-and-take song format was considered obsolete in vaudeville, having been very popular about 20 years prior. As Ed and Al performed the song, each verse comprised a complete small vaudeville routine, complete with punchline. The key to the song's long-term success was that it was a fairly simple matter to take the daily headlines and create new verses for each show. Al Shean once estimated that there had been over 4,000 verses written for the song, the vast majority of which are long forgotten. So with an act and song, Gallagher and Shean hit vaudeville. But this time the act was flipped. Ed Gallagher, the burlesque and vaudeville straight man par excellence, still had his stogie, but now, while they performed Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean, Ed Gallagher got to perform the punchline. Al Shean would still get plenty of laughs with his "Oh, Mr. Gallagher" in his Dutch Yiddish performing accent, but for the first time ever, Ed would get the last word on each verse and the punchline. So how did the new act go over? Variety, in the August 1921 issue, called Gallagher and Shean one of the strongest two-man acts in vaudeville, and also stated that the dialogue is all-timely and was good for a continuous roll of staccato laughs. In fact, the song Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean made such a strong impression that it was not long before the reviewers were stating that the rest of the act, between the singing of Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean at the beginning and ending of the act, were falling in the middle and the weight between the two high points. The song was a sensation. Remarkably, in a time when going to the theater or playing a piano or organ at home was about the only way to hear music, until if and when it might appear on a relatively low-fidelity 78 RPM record, the song's popularity spread like wildfire. Positively, Mr. Gallagher? Absolutely, Mr. Shean started to become buzzwords in cities where their act played. People started to notice Ed Gallagher and Al Shean and their very catchy patter song. So, Gallagher and Shean went to play at the Superdome theaters, followed that up by a smash at the Ziegfeld Follies, wrapped it all up with a triumphant tour of the United States, made a mint, and lived happily ever after. Not quite. Somehow Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean managed to take a hit song and make a convoluted mess of it. As mentioned earlier, Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean were making quite a stir in vaudeville with their act in Egypt. Remember the Schubert Organization and the contract they held with Ed and Al for a September show start at $7.50 per week? Well, they came a-calling about their act. Ed and Al were not young anymore, and touring was getting old. They wanted to settle down and play in one theater on a regular basis. The Schubert Organization, which were at the heart the two brothers Lee and Jake, had been paying attention to the success of Gallagher and Shean in vaudeville and decided that rather than put them in a theatrical review in New York, they would be kept in vaudeville and sent out on the road. Gallagher and Shean had not signed up for this and told the Schubert Organization to go pound sand, as they had nullified the contract that Ed and Al had signed. However, hidden in the contract, which was drafted by the Schubert master lawyer William Klein, was fine print that stated that they would still be available for vaudeville and touring. Fine print or not, per Ed and Al's reading of the contract, the Schubert Organization was to have a theatrical production ready for them by the end of September, or the contract was void. At the end of the month, they promptly signed a contract for a vaudeville season with the Keith Theatrical Organization. Right before Gallagher and Shean went on stage at the Palace, a Keith theater, they were issued an order to show why an injunction should not be served by the Schubert Organization. Gallagher and Shean ignored the order and proceeded to play at Keith's theaters at $850 per week. As expected, Schubert took Keith and Gallagher and Shean to court. The Schubert Organization claimed that Gallagher and Shean had a vaudeville contract and not a theatrical contract, and as a vaudeville act, they could and should perform in any Schubert theater immediately. Not only that, the Schuberts restated that it was they that recommended that Gallagher and Shean get back together in the first place, and that the Schubert Organization would put on any act they created. In response, Gallagher and Shean not only claimed that the Schubert Organization had not only lost the rights to their services, but since their act was not, quote, unique and extraordinary, unquote, the Schubert Organization was not losing anything of value. Eventually, the court ruled in favor of Gallagher and Shean in April of 1922. The Schubert deal was at least temporarily dead, and Ed and Al were free to pursue their careers. But the boys' legal problems were not over yet. Brian Foy, who, as you may remember, wrote the initial version of their hit song, started to regret his generosity in signing all the rights over to them. The song was published in sheet music form and rapidly became a bestseller. Other artists started recording the song, so at one point thousands of dollars were coming into Gallagher and Shean for both publishing and mechanical reproduction rights. So Mr. Foy sued, claimed to have only given the team rights to use the song on stage. Unfortunately for Mr. Foy, the judge disagreed, and in August of 1922 ruled that the documentation proved that he had sold the songs to Ed and Al for a $1,000 fee, free and clear of any encumbrances. And yet another lawsuit hit Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean when another vaudeville team, Duffy and Sweeney, filed a lawsuit to claim that Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean was a direct rip-off of their song, Mr. Duffy and Mr. Sweeney. This lawsuit soon disappeared without a trace, much like the team of Duffy and Sweeney. September 1922. Things are looking really good for Ed and Al. The Schubert Organization contract lawsuit appears resolved after the Schubert Organization lost the lawsuit and their initial appeal. However, they're still gearing up for yet another appeal. All of the other lawsuits over the ownership of the song are resolved. With the completion of their Keith's contract, Flo Ziegfeld has signed the team for his Follies of 1922, which was believed to be a typical season of September through May, at the astonishing rate of $1,500 per week. Now they have hit the big time. The Follies were only put on at the New Amsterdam Theater in New York, so no traveling. It was also a very prestigious production, and amazingly, Gallagher and Shean were two of the star attractions. Along with starting their Ziegfeld season, Ed and Al had to take care of some other business. They had very cleverly negotiated to keep the publishing and mechanical reproduction rights to the song, so they were making money when other artists recorded versions of Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean, including Ernest Aaron Billy Jones of the Sunshine Boys and Furman and Nash. When they finally did go into the Victor Studios in Camden, New Jersey on July 21, 1922 to record, they were concerned about how the session would go, and with good reason. An earlier trial run at recording them on July 5th had not gone well. Both Gallagher and Shean had fairly high-pitched voices, and the acoustic means of recording available in 1922 did not favor them. It would take several attempts to capture a usable recording. Even with the issues, Victor was so confident in the record that they decided to put Gallagher and Shean on both sides of the record with different verses of the same song. This was the first time Victor had put the same artist on both sides of a record. So on August 18th, the boys went back into the studio and recorded part 2. The completed record was put up for sale on September 22nd and went on to become one of the very few records in the 1920s to sell over 1 million copies. Despite its huge success, the record was considered to be a bit of a disappointment, as the boys chose unfamiliar verses, and much to everyone's disappointment, not a single positively Mr. Gallagher, nor not one absolutely Mr. Shean on either side of the disc, except on the label.
Good morning, Mr. Gallagher. Good morning, Mr. Shean.
1923 was looking like a banner year for Ed Gallagher and Al Shean. The act, Gallagher and Shean, by, about, and for themselves, was a smash in the Ziegfeld Follies. The record was scaling new sales heights, and their sheet music continued to be a bestseller. Variety proclaimed that Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean was the USA's second national anthem. The tagline was being used in advertising, and tailors even advertised clothes as worn by Ed Gallagher. What new heights could these suddenly immensely wealthy and famous middle-aged men scale? By movies, of course. Fox Productions came to the boys with an offer for one movie, to be called either Around the Town or Around the Town with Gallagher and Shean. Since the boys were still playing in the Follies, at least until the end of the season in May, the movie would be shot in New York. The basic plot was that Gallagher and Shean were two detectives who were hired to track down a girl, played by Lucy Fox, who has been kidnapped by the villain, played by Alan Hale. Their offices are in a secret lair in a skyscraper. While this was Ed Gallagher's first time in front of a camera, Al Shean had appeared in at least one movie in 1917. It was called Upside Down and can be assumed to be a version of his stage act, Quo Vadis Upside Down. Since it is presumed lost and there is no actual proof that it was ever released, it is likely to remain a mystery. There is also evidence that Al was going to be starring in a series of 12 upside-down comedies. As for the team Gallagher and Shean, there was quite a bit of speculation on how well the two comedians, famous for their patter song, were going to fare on the silent screen. The conclusion was that the two comedians would do just fine. As the last bit of icing on the success cake, Gallagher and Shean had a daily cartoon strip based on them. Syndicated across the country, it consisted of our two heroes having various adventures where the gimmick was that the dialogue consisted of one verse of their famous song. It wasn't all good news for Ed Gallagher in early 1923. His 6-year marriage to actress Helen Gallagher had actually more or less ended in 1922 when they separated. At the time, he gave her a lump sum in the neighborhood of $5,000. Well, Helen took a look at how well Ed was doing with his new act, record sales, advertising endorsements, and the like, and decided she wanted in on that action. At the time in New York, the only way to get a divorce was to catch her spouse in the act with someone else. And Ed Gallagher, having decided he was enjoying the high life, was only too happy to oblige with a young actress named Hilda Moreno. Detectives hired by Mrs. Gallagher caught them together at his apartment. Naturally, they both claimed innocence, but it was enough. She sued and received an annual amount of $15,000, which was based on Ed's current estimated salary of $100,000 per year, a large fortune at the time. Their peak was early 1923. Then it all started to fall apart. And remarkably, it was not due to a fickle audience getting sick of their act. The first indication of trouble was in May, when the Ziegfeld organization sued Ed and Al. The Ziegfeld Follies of 1922 had been a huge success, and Ziegfeld wanted to extend the show so that instead of ending in May, the usual close dates for the summer for Broadway productions, they wanted to extend the Follies for an indeterminate period of time. Ziegfeld wanted Ed and Al on stage, as they were basically headlining the show at this point, and as far as the Follies were concerned, the boys would be there, as their contract dated April 8, 1922, stated that they would play the Follies, quote, for the run thereof, unquote. The Gallagher and Shean saw it differently, however. From their perspective, they'd signed a standard performance contract that ended on May 31st, 1923. Moreover, Ziegfeld argued that he had exclusive rights to Gallagher and Shean, and that the lawsuit also sought to keep the boys from making the movie with Fox. Eventually, the boys decided to stick with Ziegfeld, and the suit was dropped. Their salary was bumped to $2,500 a week as they continued to star in Ziegfeld's show as it was taken on the road. In early September, Bernard Durning, the director of the movie Around the Town, died of typhoid fever in New York. This shut down production of the film until a new director could be located and sent to New York from Hollywood. With the arrival of the new director, Thomas Buckingham, filming recommenced, but Ed Gallagher soon took ill with shingles. There was also a rumor that he was going blind, but he assured his public that his vision was fine. Scuttlebutt started circulating that the film and the team were duds, and that Ed Gallagher was proving to be impossible to work with, and, once again, filming ceased. This time it was never restarted. Later that year, Fox canceled the production. At least for Ed Gallagher, the end of their movie career was no great loss. They were still major stars, and making great money at one of the best shows in town. So what could go wrong? Well, the Schubert Organization, that's what. They had not given up on Gallagher and Shean after losing both the first lawsuit and appeal. They appealed again, and this time they won. The appellate court found that the talents of Gallagher and Shean were irreplaceable, and that the team was enjoined from working for any other organization than Schubert's. Obviously, this was not what Ed and Al wanted, so they immediately took their case to the New York Court of Appeals. Unfortunately for them, the court declined to take up the case. They did not do so primarily because the lower court had yet to appoint a referee to determine how much Gallagher and Shean owed the Schubert Organization for the year plus they had performed elsewhere while still under contract to Schubert. That number was never made public. However, on a typical Schubert vaudeville contract, there is a clause that states if a contract is breached by a performer who plays or performs in any other theater during the contract's life, they will pay a penalty of $3,000 per week. It is implied that the Schubert Organization basically was entitled to all of the money that Gallagher and Shean had made at the Follies, and then some. One article indicated that Schubert was willing to settle for $15,000, which the boys claimed they did not have. Gallagher and Shean were ordered by the Schubert Organization to immediately cease performing at the Ziegfeld Follies and to start appearing in a new show in Schubert-owned theaters no later than November 19, 1923. As promising as 1923 had started, the end of the year saw the business side of things resolve on a much darker note. The Schubert contract that they were being forced to uphold was to pay them $1,000 per week instead of the $2,500 Ziegfeld had been paying them. Ed and Al would be okay with working for the Schubert Organization if the money was better, but not at $1,000 per week. There was a proposal that Gallagher and Shean stay on at the Follies and repay the Schubert Organization the $15,000 out of their salary on a weekly basis. Flo Ziegfeld, however, decided he could live without the act and declined to have them continue performing. Ed and Al had lost their Ziegfeld booking and refused to perform at Schubert's to fulfill their contract. So the boys were sidelined and off the stage until the total Schubert contract damages were calculated and how they were going to pay it. Ed, and to a much smaller degree Al, had spent their money while the dough was rolling in, but it was Ed with his alimony payments, new house, and extravagant lifestyle that really felt the pinch. On the more positive side of the ledger, at least it seemed that way at the time, Ed Gallagher remarried again, this time to the actress Ann Luther on December 5th. Al Shean acted as his best man, and you can guess what song was sung at the wedding. The year started with Ed and Al benched as the ongoing Schubert settlement progressed. Finally, in February, a deal was made. The Schubert Organization sold their Gallagher and Shean contract to the firm of Green and Jones for $20,000. Under the terms of the deal, Ed and Al would be paid $3,000 a week for a 3-year contract, and they would immediately start appearing in the New Greenwich Follies, a touring vaudeville show. However, half of their weekly salary would be withheld until Green and Jones were paid back the $20,000 given to the Schubert Organization. Financially, at least in the short term, This was not ideal for Gallagher and Shean, but there was no other options for them except work for the Schubert organization, which was not acceptable. Gallagher and Shean toured in the New Greenwich Follies for the rest of 1924. In September, knowing that their act was getting long in tooth, they opened in a new act they had devised called In Dutch. This was not a dramatically different act for them, basically a few new songs and the addition of a new member to the team. She was Fifi Lucier, whom years after being with Gallagher and Shean changed her name to Fifi d'Orsay after her favorite perfume. She was a chorus girl in the New Greenwich Follies until she caught the roving eye of Ed Gallagher. She was promoted into the act, and Ed was going to make her a star. Al Shean's opinion of all this is not recorded. During the performance of Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean, Fifi would join them on stage and sing a verse with her French accent. Of course, it was all an act. Fifi was from Ontario, Canada, and had never been close to France. Ed being Ed, it was not long before he was caught in public with a lip lock with Fifi. Naturally, it was written off as a publicity stunt. Also in September, the team was sued again. This time it was Fox Films suing them for $100,000 for the failure to complete Around the Town. Fox argued that Ed Gallagher refused to complete the movie, and without the team of Gallagher and Shean, then the movie could not be made. If one is counting, this is the 5th lawsuit the team had directed against them in 2 years. With Schubert taking half of their weekly salary, lawyers' fees, and for Ed, alimony payments, their finances were getting tight. The year started with the announcement that In Dutch was having issues and was expected to be withdrawn in the near future. Shortly thereafter, it was announced that In Dutch was going to be recast and sent on the road. This was to be a long tour out west, which, as you may recall, was exactly what Ed and Al did not want. Even more shortly thereafter, it was announced that In Dutch was canceled and Ed and Al reverted back to their old act. Bills had to be paid, so in late January, Ed and Al started off as cast members of the road version of the New Greenwich Follies. After performing on the West Coast, the show would then head to London. But they would go to London without Gallagher and Shean. In early July 1925, Gallagher left the New Greenwich Follies with Fifi Lucier and headed back to Broadway. Al Shean stayed with the Follies for at least the time being. Gallagher and Shean were through. Ed and Fifi never made it to Broadway. In late September, a new version of the show, See America First, was announced, and Ed was supposed to be starring in it. The show, which was originally produced in 1916, was never staged. It was also about this time that Ed Gallagher started behaving somewhat oddly. First, he found himself back in court to defend himself against a young woman named Marie Chase. Apparently, she had borrowed a $600 ring from Ed, and to try to get the ring back, he was keeping her clothes that just happened to be at Ed's house. The judge, who was probably wondering why he had to deal with this in the first place, simply told them to swap items. Case closed. A few weeks later, he announced a new revue that would feature Ted Lewis, whose moniker was Mr. Entertainment, and was one of the most popular band leaders of the time. Rehearsals for the new show were being held at Ed's house at Beechhurst, Long Island. Less than a month later, it is reported that the rehearsals and the revue were canceled due to Ed's behavior. Members of the cast said that they, quote, couldn't get heads or tails of what Gallagher was talking about, unquote. Shortly thereafter, Ed was hospitalized with restraints at town's private hospital. It was never reported why, except for the generic nervous breakdown diagnosis reported to the press. It is widely believed that after their breakup in July of 1925, that Ed and Al never spoke again. But that is not true, as it was reported in December of 1925 that as soon as Ed's health had returned, they were planning on a return to Broadway. It had been rehearsing their act. Unfortunately, that never happened. By 1926, Ed was ill and broke. In January, a writ was served to him for his Beechhurst house and furniture to satisfy a $2,400 judgment against him from the Edison Financing Company. When served with it, he announced he was moving to Miami to improve his health, and his re-entry into vaudeville with Al would have to wait. His car was repossessed shortly thereafter, as he owed another $4,354 again to the Edison Financing Company for it. They claimed he had not made a payment since the previous July, right about the same time he left Al Shean and the New Greenwich Follies. He sold his home to the cabaret and vaudeville artist Harry Richmond for $55,000 and moved into the Empire Hotel in New York City. It was from there that Ed was committed to a mental hospital in August of 1926. His ex-wife Helen, who had been taking care of him during his many illnesses, signed the commitment papers, even though Ed was married to Ann Luther at this time. Helen had stood by Gallagher through his many illnesses, and when Ann divorced Ed in August of 1927, Helen continued to support him. In April 1928, it was reported that Ed had suffered a paralytic stroke at the Rivercrest Sanitarium, which is where he had been confined to since his nervous breakdown in 1926. He soon suffered another stroke in July, and his condition was deemed an ominous indeterminate. He was practically penniless at this time. In March of 1929, it was reported that Ed had received his first letter in over 3 years. The sender included $20 for the purchase of flowers to cheer him up. Ed passed away shortly thereafter, on March 28th. He was 55 years old. Variety had a lengthy obituary for Ed, and as a nod to show how well he was known and still remembered, he appeared in Time magazine's obituary column. Al's life went in a considerably different direction than his ex-partner after the breakup. After splitting with Ed Gallagher, he continued to perform Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean with either James Carson or Lynn Cantor. He would continue to perform with Lynn off and on through 1929. There would be the occasional new sketch, such as the Office sketch, but Al would always fall back on the tried and true song. Also in 1928, Al Shean sued Ed Gallagher for $8,000 in back royalties for the song Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean. This was widely considered to be an ill-advised publicity stunt, as Ed was flat broke and paralyzed at the time. On an amusing note, in 1936, Al's son Al Jr. and Ed's adopted son Ed Jr. collaborated on a screenplay to portray their fathers in a story about Gallagher and Shean. Unfortunately, this never came to pass. Unlike Ed Gallagher, Al Shean had been very cautious with his money during the peak earning years, and even with all the lawsuits had still managed to save a fair amount. Unfortunately, he lost most of it in the stock market crash of October 1929 and had to keep working. And work he did. Over the next 20 years, he performed in over 20 motion pictures, innumerable stage performances, radio, and even television. And even though he claimed in 1937 to be sick of people asking me to recite those jingles we used to do, the song Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean remained a stock part of his acting portfolio for the rest of his life. His last performance in front of a movie camera came in 1944 for the movie Atlantic City, in which he donned his fez and funny jacket one more time and performed the famous song with Jack Kenny standing in for Ed Gallagher. Al's wife Joanna passed away in 1944. In an interview at age 80, Al showed no signs of slowing down and was interested in doing more television work. He didn't understand why people were so interested in the past instead of the future. Al Shean passed away on August 12, 1949 at age 81. His death was covered in most of the trade magazines at the time, as well as many major newspapers. He was considered the grand old man of vaudeville. So why did Ed and Al break up the second time? Neither of them ever spoke publicly about it. In fact, Al Shean never mentioned Ed Gallagher again in public, except as part of performing the song. It is pretty easy to speculate about what happened, though. Even with a huge hit show and song, the pressure of 5 different lawsuits all within the space of 2 years, with their ensuing costs, must have been enormous. Also, the loss of the Schubert lawsuit financially was a huge burden for both, but of course mainly to Ed, who literally lost everything. Several articles at the time indicated that Ed, a hugely talented straight man, was very difficult to work with. Al was the polar opposite. Very easygoing and by all accounts a true pleasure to work with. Once they'd made enough to pay back the Schubert organization and have some money left over, they just had enough. Of the song, of the whole racket, and of each other. And who can blame them? The failure of Around the Town in 1923 has already been discussed. But what other movie evidence do we have of one of the greatest comedy teams of the 1920s? Actually, surprisingly little. There is a brief newsreel clip of them both, which amusingly shows Al Shean carrying his fishing pole. There is also a well-known sound film clip that Theodore Case made in 1925 that purports to show Gallagher and Shean in action. Unfortunately, we can rule out the possibility of this actually being Gallagher and Shean. There is a complete non-resemblance to Ed Gallagher that the fellow on the left has, although it must be admitted that the other man does look like Al Shean. But ultimately, the timeline does not work out. Theodore Case was making his test sound movies in the summer of 1925, which is when Gallagher and Shean were out on the West Coast in the process of breaking up. So, alas, no sound footage of Gallagher and Shean. The closest film version we probably have is Max Fleischer's screen song from 1931, entitled Mr. Gallagher and Mr. Shean.
I gotta go. Well, I am Mr. Shean. Mr. Gallagher. Oh, Mr. Gallagher. I'm sure that everybody knows our song.
Gallagher and Shean were no more, but what of the song? For a whole generation of Americans, there could be only one answer to positively Mr. Gallagher, and that was, of course, absolutely Mr. Shean. Children would sing it, businesses would use it for advertising, and other vaudeville acts would steal it shamelessly. In 1938, Bing Crosby and Johnny Mercer recorded a jazzy remake of the song that went to number 7 on the charts. An Australian cleaning product called Mr. Shean used the song in advertising in the 1960s. Even as late as 1984, Pitney Bowes was using the tagline of the song in their advertising. Kensico Cemetery is a large cemetery located in Valhalla, New York. On its grounds is a plot established by the National Vaudeville Association, or NVA. Members paid nominal sums, and in return they received assistance with doctor's fees and were provided interment in the NVA plot if they died indigent. Today, almost completely hidden in the grass, a small bronze plaque marks the final resting spot of Ed Gallagher. Not that far away, in Mount Pleasant Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, lay the remains of Al Shean. A far larger headstone marks his location. His stone has one final verse to his famous song inscribed on it, and either on accident or as one last prank on the world, the famous line has the declaratives reversed. Absolutely, Mr. Gallagher. Positively, Mr. Shean.
Why, Mr. Shean? Why, Mr. Shean? On the day they took away our old canteen, cost of living went so high that it's cheaper now to die. Positively, Mr. Gallagher. Absolutely, Mr. Shean.